Okay. Before I start, I have two things of note. The first is I only received this paper, this wonderful paper you just heard, in mid-December. And at the time I was in France working on another project. And then there was the holidays. So I haven't had enough time to really develop the ideas the way I would have. They're somewhat potted. So that is one thing. And the other is I have a chest virus that has just fallen in love with my chest. Just can't, doesn't want to leave my lungs, finding it really nice. So I might need to stop for water or for a cough drop, okay? Okay, Professor Bedarida has examined 4 major post-war exhibitions in the United States and Italy in order to argue for the depoliticization of art produced under fascism. These exhibitions have been chosen because of their large size, their significant venues, and the powerful men who curated them. Given their importance, Bedarida is able to generalize from these 4 shows that the fascist content and or context of art produced during the Ventennio has been largely erased and continues to be erased. Even more recent shows, he concludes, like the Prada show, quote, reveal a shared tendency to give, once again, a depoliticized, purely aesthetic reading of the arts produced under fascism. These exhibitions, Bedarida argues, managed to ignore the fascist path through a number of curatorial strategies. Chief among them was a focus on the aesthetics of fascist art, or its pure visibility, as Bedarida calls it. Ironically, then, curators emphasized visibility as a means for erasure. But in depoliticizing these artifacts, they created, according to Bedarida, their own politics of art. Each of Bedarida's 4 exhibitions demonstrates subtle ways in which curators, artists, and scholars shaped collective memory of the Ventennio. The first one took place in MoMA in New York City in 1949, very close to the end of the war. Motivated by Cold War concerns, the exhibition emphasized a renaissance, a new renaissance of Italy. Here, the curatorial strategy was to show fascist art as a parenthesis rather than a continuing, well-rooted preoccupation. Although scholars dismissed fascist modernism in the catalog as a reactionary phase, it was very well represented and integrated into the show. The show juxtaposed Modigliani's art with that of Renato Guttuso and Marino Marini, whose work had been fully supported by the fascist regime. This juxtaposition, in turn, drew the fascist artists into a powerful Italian artistic tradition which both preceded and followed them. The effect was to rehabilitate fascist artists by absorbing them into a long-revered Italian aesthetic. The curators also ignored the fascist past of Guttuso and Marini, who, once introduced to the American market, the American art market, became quite successful. The MoMA show set a pattern in which art produced under the fascist regime was exhibited, bought, and sold for generations of collectors and curators. The first exhibition of fascist art in Italy came in 1967 under the curatorial leadership of Carlo Ludovico Raggianti. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names. Is it Raggianti? Yeah. That doesn't help at all, but thanks. Okay. Raggianti was an anti-fascist resistor who had been jailed during the war. He epitomized and reinforced the myth of the good Italian, the one who had fallen prey to, but then resisted, the fascist regime. This redemptive past allowed him to take what Bedarida calls a non-prescriptive approach to editorial practice. For example, the exhibition included many paintings by Jewish artists. Not only were there stories of persecution, censorship, and political activists untold, argues Bedarida, but even their selection of the work, based purely on stylistic criteria, left out the pieces with more explicitly Jewish or anti-fascist content. Raggianti was well equipped, reputation-wise, to begin what came to be the domestic aestheticization or the aesthetic domestication of fascist art. The logic went something like this. If former resistors can ignore fascist politics in art, well, then everyone else can as well. Bedarida's third exhibition, which Renato Barille curated in Milan in 1982, further separated Ventennio art from fascist politics by reinventing that period as the origin of the Italian luxury industry. The exhibition combined high art with artisanal craft. It claimed that the Ventennio most importantly served as the origin, not of fascism, but of luxury goods, fashion, shoes, jewelry, leather, that increasingly would come to define Italian identity in the late 20th century. Again, visitors were not encouraged to historicize or critically engage with any of the artifacts on display. Here, however, and this is important to what I will say below, there existed some critics who complained that the exhibition had spectacularized and sentimentalized the fascist past. So we have a voice of criticism for the first time. Finally, Bedarida examines Salant's exhibition of fascist art in 2018 at the Prada Foundation, again in Milan. Salant engaged himself here with still another strategy of curation, one of erasure, which was to delete context with context itself. Salant produced an, quote, exhibition of exhibitions. That is, he staged the artworks exactly as they had been staged during the Ventennio. The desired effect was to contextualize the art aesthetically. That is, to give it a context that was aesthetic, but not historical or controversial. So in that very aesthetic contextualization was the erasure of historical context, thus releasing Salant of accountability for ignoring the politics of fascism. In other words, Salant used a neutral aesthetic context to avoid a more controversial one. But again, here, and importantly, crucially, critics were not fooled by Salant's trompe. They complained that the beauty and seduction of the exhibit echoed those qualities of fascist propaganda. This element of increasingly critical engagement with art exhibits, both in 1982 and 2018, leads to my first question to Dr. Bedarida, one that addresses the total absence of historical context in his paper. Like Salant's Prada show, your analysis of these exhibitions lacks a larger context. How have Italians remembered the Ventennio beyond the walls of these museums? What politics of memory concerning fascism and the war have operated in Italy? Finally, and most importantly, how do these exhibitions fit into or map onto the larger politics of memory in Italy? Contrary to what Bedarida says, many scholars have dealt with the politics of memory throughout the fascist period, particularly the years 1940 to 1945. Like France, Italy's involvement in the war was mixed. While Mussolini was originally allied with the Axis powers, that collaboration ended in the summer of 1943 when the Duce was thrown out of power and his successor Badoglio surrendered to the Allies. The Germans then occupied the nation and a civil war between fascists and partisans began. The transitions of 1943 created a confused war legacy for the Italians, who were quick to blur collaboration and occupation, fascism and resistance. Again, as in the case in France, this mixed legacy of the war allowed Italians to largely erase their prior enthusiasm for Mussolini, as well as their earlier alliance with Hitler. According to scholar Rosario Forlenzo, the post-war myth of the good Italian structured an historical narrative in which Italians were victims of the fascist era and eager to resist it after 1943. On my first trip to Rome several years ago, I was struck by the fact that the Museo Storico della Liberazione seemed to be the city's only site of memory concerning the war, besides, of course, Mussolini's wedding cake or palace. The museum, in what was formerly a Nazi prisoner, the museum, which was formerly a Nazi prison for Italian anti-fascist partisans, celebrates the resistance efforts of what was a very tiny proportion of the Italian population. A less knowledgeable tourist might have concluded that Italian wartime story was one of victimhood and resistance. In this way, the last 2 years of the war, when Italy was occupied and subject to Nazi persecution, have airbrushed the earlier years of fascist popularity and Nazi collaboration. Particularly erased was Italian cooperation in the Nazi deportation of Jews. Scholars Stefania Manca and Marcella Passarel have summarized it in this way, and I quote, "Italy is one of the Western countries that has emphasized anti-Nazi resistance over pervasive local collaboration during the Holocaust." Historian Gary Schwartz agrees that critical reflection concerning Italy's role in the Holocaust was delayed until very, very recently. As Schwartz writes, and any analysis of the real nature of the tragedy was hindered while the part played by the local population in assisting the Nazi extermination project was simultaneously airbrushed out of the picture. The state made no effort to examine the issue of Italian responsibility in wartime persecution of Jews. The narrative of the good Italian held sway over memory of the war years until the 1980s, about the time when critics and journalists began to criticize Renato Barille's exhibition in Milan, which was 1982. The tendency to finally confront the truth of the war again parallels that of France, where the same decade, the 1980s, began an earnest, widespread effort to account for Vichy collaboration and the deportation of the French Jews. In both nations that decade, intense debates in newspapers, films, and other media allowed repressed stories to finally come to the surface. The Italian inability to confront the wartime past maps neatly onto Bedarida's narrative of erasure concerning fascist art, and thus could further illuminate his theme of growing critical engagement. As he points out in his coda, progress has been slow. Although the Prada exhibit in 2018 came under fire for not representing, quote, the reality of violence and oppression, in general, commemoration events still prioritize German over Italian guilt and invoke the bad German and the good Italian. The state and the public have continued to avoid the roles played by civilians and political officers in the deportation of Jews. Bedarida's own intervention in the history of exhibitions thus exemplifies a new honesty concerning how fascist artifacts are given meaning in the post-war decades. His analysis of exhibitions over time and his critical exegesis of such exhibitions reflects a growing willingness among contemporaries to address the silences of the fascist past. I'm going to call his artists escape artists. The escape artist aestheticization of art is by no means a strategy confined to Italy. I've already mentioned France, now I'm going to talk about Germany. Leni Riefenstahl, whose powerful documentary, Triumph of the Will, converted millions of Germans to Nazism in the 1930s, yet she maintained until her death that she was just producing good art. For decades, the German state forbade the showing of the film. You could neither buy it or show it in Germany, and denounced it as propaganda and certainly not art. The banning of Riefenstahl's film typifies the post-war approach to Nazi art. Bedarida evokes a comparison with the German case in passing when he notes that MoMA would wait until 1957 to hold a show of German art, none of which included Nazi-supported artists. The treatment of Nazi art in the post-war era provides an illuminating contrast to the Italian case, and I'm going to explore it here very briefly using the works of Pamela Potter and one of my graduate students, Jennifer Gramer. At the end of the war, American Captain Gordon Gilkey, upon being victorious with the Allies in Germany, confiscated about 9,000 works of art created by artists working in the Nazi regime. This so-called German war art collection was sent to the United States for storage in Washington, D.C., apparently to protect the German people from lingering Nazi influence. So it was part of their denazification campaign. And incidentally, that art is still, some of it is still in storage in Washington, D.C., because Gramer actually went to this place and saw, hundreds of canvases in the dark hanging around. Some also has been put on permanent loan to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Now, for years, again, the art lay hidden in this warehouse, and a great deal of it evoked Nazi imagery, swastikas and Hitler and so on and so forth. But others, paintings, featured really anodyne subjects like landscapes and nudes. And as Gramer demonstrates quite brilliantly, only in the 1950s did the US, deciding that affairs in Germany were safer for democracy, return several thousand paintings to West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. But for 3 years, the Chancellor let the shipment of art, which went from Washington, D.C. to Germany, languish in a harbor in Bremerhaven. So for 3 years, it's in that harbor, just demonstrating his own reluctance to publicly accept it. Only in the next generation, represented by the '68 youth movement and a nascent Green Party, made the artwork newly relevant. In this case, not to enjoy aesthetically, but to provoke a moment of reckoning. More artwork was sent back to West Germany, where it was viewed finally for the first time in 1974 in an exhibition in Frankfurt. Although the presence of Nazi art in museums or exhibitions was still considered a moral affront to the victims of Nazi persecution, 36,000 people attended the show, tellingly titled, Art in the Third Reich, Documents of Oppression. The exhibition sparked a large-scale debate among politicians and the public about the place of art within contemporary West German culture. In this way, art became a vehicle for a larger Vergangenheitsbewältigung, sorry, I always have trouble with that, which basically is the German word for coming to terms with the Nazi past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Even this too brief account of the post-war fate of Nazi art reveals a sharp contrast with the Italian case. Nazi art, unlike Italian fascist art, was locked away rather than integrated into a long aesthetic tradition. The West Germans, unlike Italian curators, artists, and scholars, were extremely reluctant to exhibit wartime art, believing it to be dangerous, overly provocative, and morally reprehensible. When Nazi art was finally given an exhibition in 1974, it was not only de-aestheticized, but it was highly historicized under the theme Documents of Oppression. The West German case also reveals a lost opportunity for the Italians. Rather than use artwork as a means of reckoning with the past, Italians allowed it to be encased in a steel box of aesthetics. Ironically, pure visibility. That framework reinforced old myths rather than break silence, a very important silence about the past. So my second and final question to Dr. Bedarida is the following. How can we explain the difference between German art and Italian art here? And I'm just going to end with two speculations in the form of questions, but I'd be very interested in see how you all explain the difference between an art that was basically reintegrated, aestheticized, and allowed to be exhibited, and one which was literally shut out and shut away for decades, and then understood in historical and strictly historical terms. I have two speculations. Could it be because art, and in particular painting, has traditionally had a stronger place in Italian, but not German culture? Or, for second, does it have to do with the clarity of guilt on Germany's part in contrast to the self-proclaimed ambiguity of guilt on Italy's part? I thank you for listening, and I leave you with these questions, which I hope we can discuss. Thank you.